Today, we're focusing on a period of Roman history that is just extraordinarily sharp and brutal.
And short, we're talking about just 14 years.
Exactly. From 364 to 378 AD. It's a snapshot that historians, they often treat it as a prelude to the bigger collapse of the West.
Just a stepping stone to the main event.
Right. But when you zoom in on these specific years, you see the actual, the real-time mechanisms of imperial failure. It's all right there.
That's so true. And our sources for this deep dive are intensely rich. We're looking at political decisions, massive military campaigns, a verifiable natural disaster of terrifying scale.
And critically, the simultaneous collapse of frontier defenses across the entire massive empire, all at once.
Yeah, so our goal is to synthesize these events, to understand how these internal divisions and these seismic, uncontrollable external pressures combined.
How they brought the seemingly invincible Roman world to its knees in just over a decade.
And the central idea that sort of frames this period, it comes from the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, whose work is just absolutely vital here.
He is our main guide. He was describing this time, this 14-year window, and he coined this amazing phrase.
The ferocity of changeable circumstances.
It's perfect, isn't it? He saw that Rome's religion and its frontiers were shifting and decaying as quickly as its own leaders.
So we're going to unpack that phrase. We'll show how political instability fed psychological trauma, which in turn just accelerated the whole breakdown.
The military and administrative breakdown of the entire empire.
Okay, let's unpack this. We begin in immediate political chaos. The year is 364 AD.
Right, and the recently appointed Emperor Jovian, who was the man who negotiated that pretty disastrous peace treaty with the Persians.
He dies suddenly.
And our sources tell us that in a mere 4 years, the entire empire had already burned through 3 emperors.
3 in 4 years. That is instant, baked-in instability.
Precisely. And this rapid turnover is so critical because it highlights a really profound and dangerous shift in political legitimacy.
The old ways of doing things were gone.
Totally. The traditional Roman mechanisms for choosing a leader, the Senate, the established civic protocols, they had become peripheral. I mean, if not completely irrelevant.
And it's clear from the sources that the ultimate authority, it didn't reside in Rome anymore, or even in Constantinople.
Absolutely not. The legitimacy of the emperor was now derived solely from the consensus of the military.
The army.
The army, specifically the high-ranking generals, they had become the de facto representatives for the entire empire in choosing a leader.
And Jovian had a son, right, an infant.
He did, but the sources are clear there was no real support for his claim. The generals wanted immediate, proven competence. They needed a strong soldier to stabilize the frontier, and they needed him yesterday.
And that search for a strong soldier leads us directly to the rise of Valentinian.
Yes, the army chose Valentinian. He was 43, a career soldier through and through, a tough military man.
And also described as a zealous Christian.
Which is this intersection of deep military experience and strong Christian zealotry that makes getting an accurate picture of him so difficult.
Because the contemporary sources are just so biased.
Completely. They're either pushing him up or tearing him down, depending on their own loyalties.
This is where those contrasting views are so illuminating. You have the traditional Roman historian, Zosimus. He represents the old guard, the classically educated philosophical elite.
And Zosimus describes Valentinian with this sort of grudging respect. He calls him, quote, an excellent soldier, but extremely illiterate.
You can just feel that Roman aristocratic bias, can't you?
Oh, it's palpable. The emphasis is all on education and traditional civic virtue. To Zosimus, Valentinian was a good field commander, sure, but maybe unfit to rule because he wasn't spending his days reading Cicero.
But then you flip to the Christian historian, Theodore, who absolutely loved him.
Right. Theodore just rhapsodizes about him, calling him a man distinguished not only for his courage, but also for prudence, temperance, justice, and great stature.
So a saint and a giant.
Pretty much. But the reality, when we piece it together, is that at this precise moment in 364 AD, the empire didn't need a learned leader.
No, it didn't need a philosopher king.
It desperately needed an experienced general who could command respect and stabilize the ship. And Valentinian fit that description perfectly.
The tragedy, though, is that his very first decision, right as he was being crowned at Nicaea, proved questionable and, ultimately catastrophic.
The decision to declare a co-emperor.
Right away.
He hadn't even secured an heir yet, and the sources say he made this decision citing a soldier's precaution.
The idea that life was cheap on the road, and if something happened to him, the empire would just descend back into chaos.
Splitting the massive administrative and military load on the surface seemed pragmatic.
But our sources suggest this was a huge, unnecessary risk. Why? I mean, what was the real danger?
The risk wasn't dividing the work. It was dividing the purple, the imperial power, based on family ties rather than merit.
He was importing a domestic problem right into the imperial structure.
Precisely. Ammianus recounts this incredible scene where Valentinian gathers his senior officers to ask their opinion of his younger brother, Valens.
And you can just imagine the silence in that room.
It must have been so charged. I mean, these are the men who fought and bled for the empire. They knew Valens was not prepared for this.
And then we get that incredible moment where the cavalry commander finally breaks the silence with that stark, almost prophetic advice.
He basically put his career on the line to say what needed to be said. The officer's reply was, "Your Highness, if you love your kin, you have a brother. But if you love the state, look carefully for a man to invest with the purple."
Wow. That's about as direct as you can get with an emperor.
It's the moment where the need for state security and the emperor's personal emotional attachment just collide head on.
He's basically saying, he's your brother, fine, but he's a political liability.
He is. And if Valentinian was such a successful soldier, which everyone agrees he was, why did he lack the political foresight to heed such critical warning?
That's the key distinction, isn't it? His foresight failed, not in military strategy, but in delegation, in institutional awareness.
He chose Valens based on relationship, not competence, and that guaranteed conflict down the line. By ignoring that counsel, Valentinian signaled that his personal comfort, his dynastic security, trumped the objective needs of the state.
It was a failure of the commander-in-chief to prioritize the state over his kin.
And this one flawed choice just instantly defines the next 14 years of turmoil.
Valentinian took the west, setting up his court in Milan, which itself reflects a gradual shift of focus away from the city of Rome.
Right, and he gave Valens the east, all the way up to Thracia, though Valens settled even further east at Antioch on the Orontes River.
Right on the border with Persia.
And that spatial division created two completely different types of leadership, which just set the stage for disaster.
You had the senior emperor, the experienced soldier in the west, focused on the immediate tangible dangers of the Rhine and the Danube.
And the junior, and critically, the utterly inexperienced emperor in the east, facing the enormous threat of the Persians.
The results of that disastrous delegation became evident almost immediately. The moment the brothers split the empire, they essentially created two different states with two completely different priorities.
And the entire empire was immediately besieged by military problems across four major fronts, all at the same time.
It was a true stress test.
For sure. You had Germanic tribes invading Gaul and across the Danube in the heart of Europe. Roman holdings in Britannia were under attack by natives and sea raiders.
There were style tribes to the south and North Africa.
And most ominously, the Persian king Shaper in the east was stirring. He was claiming the recent peace treaty with Jovian was void because the guy who signed it was dead.
That is a forefront war, and neither brother had the resources to handle it alone.
Not even close.
So let's analyze the coping mechanisms. Valentinian, in the West, he showed what the sources call a calculated tolerance.
He was a committed Nicene Christian, but he was pragmatically lenient toward Arian Christians and, crucially, to the followers of the traditional Roman state religion.
His pragmatism was his saving grace, at least at first.
It was. He understood that unity was a military imperative. He did pass a law restricting evening sacrifices to the gods, which on the surface looks like an aggressive Christianizing move.
Good.
But the moment his proconsul pointed out that these ancient customs were fundamental to the civic identity of Roman subjects, that they were part of what defined Roman society, Valentinian immediately ordered the law to be disregarded.
He valued social cohesion over theological purity.
Exactly. He was willing to compromise his faith's dominance for the sake of political stability. That's a massive insight into effective leadership during a crisis.
It is. Now contrast that with Valens's approach in the East.
A whole different story. Valens belonged to the Arian branch of Christianity, and the sources describe him as entirely and aggressively intolerant of any other doctrine.
Especially the Nicene version that his own brother favored.
Right.
Okay, so we should probably pause here and just clarify what that theological distinction actually meant, because it drove everything Valens did. What was the Arian-Nicene controversy?
It was the single most defining theological schism of the 4th century. The Nicene doctrine, which came from the Council of Nicaea, held that Christ was homoousios,
Meaning of the same substance as God the Father.
co-equal and co-eternal. But the Arian doctrine, which Valens followed, believed Christ was homoousios.
Of a similar substance.
Or, more simply, that Christ was subordinate to and created by God the Father.
So it sounds like a tiny, super nuanced point of debate, a single letter's difference in Greek.
It was, but it was effectively an unbridgeable political schism.
And to Valens, anyone who held the Nicene view wasn't just wrong.
They were actively promoting heresy. And this intolerance was absolutely crippling to his ability to govern. Instead of preparing his poorly garrisoned eastern border for Shapur's Persian attack, Valens launched a war of extermination against Nicene Christians in his own city of Antioch.
So he was literally draining his limited resources to fight his own subjects.
At the exact moment he needed them united to face an external, existential threat. It's the core mechanism of his failure.
He was so preoccupied with achieving inner purity and theological dominance that he completely ignored the outer threats.
And this distraction gave the Persians far more freedom to harass the eastern border. The historian Zosimus, summing up Valens' tenure, had this damning assessment. He had so little experience with governing that he could not sustain the weight of business.
His ideological fixation made him incompetent.
It did. And you see, the empire, already split, was now functioning on two completely different threat models. The West was focused on pragmatic unity against barbarians.
And the East was focused on religious purification while facing its most strategic enemy, the Persians.
Right. Ammianus Marcellinus, surveying all this chaos, summarized the scope of the crisis perfectly. He said, during this period, practically the whole Roman world heard the trumpet call of war.
And they were already stretched thin before the completely unpredictable hit them.
If political turmoil and religious strife weren't enough, just a year into this new dual regime, the world threw an utterly terrifying, unpredictable catastrophe at them.
This wasn't a planned barbarian maneuver. This was nature itself just revolting.
We are talking about the massive Mediterranean earthquake and tsunami that struck on July 21, 365 AD. This was not a localized event.
No. The sources describe an earthquake rumbling deep beneath the sea, but the devastation on land was instant and widespread. Buildings collapsed flat in Crete, in Cyrenaica.
And the shock traveled across the entire southern Med to Corinth, Italy, Sicily, Egypt, Syria.
But the most visceral and haunting account comes from Ammianus Marcellinus. He gives us this quasi-eyewitness account of what happened at Alexandria, right at the Nile Delta.
It is a stunning passage. He describes the sea being sucked suddenly away from the shore. I mean, just imagine the sight, the entire harbor, the seabed just exposed.
And Ammianus paints this surreal image of people, recovering from the initial shock of the earthquake, and they start walking out onto this exposed seabed.
Yeah, and they're seeing many kinds of sea creatures stuck fast in the slime, and vast mountains and deep valleys. Ships that had been floating just moments before were now stranded on dry land.
The sources note that people were so disoriented that they were just roaming about, gathering fish and shells without fear.
They literally treated this apocalyptic moment as some kind of entertainment.
And that lack of fear is so critical because it speaks to the psychological trauma of it all. They had no frame of reference for this.
But that entertainment, it lasted for less than an hour.
And then the return.
Ammianus describes the return wave. He writes that the roaring sea, resenting, as it were, this forced retreat, rose in its turn, and over the boiling shoals it dashed mightily upon islands and broad stretches of the mainland, and leveled innumerable buildings.
The scale of the destruction sounds almost mythological. Thousands died instantly by drowning. Ships were splintered. And the force of the water was so great that bodies were tossed into streets, across the tops of buildings, sometimes miles inland.
And Ammianus gives this specific, unforgettable anecdote to drive home the sheer power of it. He noted that several years later, while traveling, he saw the wreck of a ship.
The one that was 2 full miles inland.
2 full miles inland from the sea, it seems just decaying on the sand. That image, a ship sitting on dry land far from the coast, it must have been so psychologically disturbing. It disrupted their entire concept of the physical world.
And in the immediate wake of this trauma, the internal instability didn't just pause. Valens, still in the east, immediately faced the usurper Procopius,
A cousin of the deceased Emperor Julian.
who capitalized on all that fear and chaos.
Procopius was brilliant in his timing. He managed to convince the Gothic soldiers in the Eastern Army to support his claim, basically arguing that the cosmic order itself had been broken.
Which, given the tsunami, probably wasn't a hard sell.
Not at all. Valens was so desperate he sent a frantic message to Valentinian for help, but Valentinian was too busy fighting the Alemanni in Gaul. He couldn't send anything.
So Valens had to handle this alone, and he'd do it with pure, cynical pragmatism.
Bribery. He successfully bribed Procopius's two chief generals and part of his army to turn against him. Valens won the battle at Thyatira, but
Then, showing he learned nothing about loyalty, he executed Procopius brutally, tearing him apart.
And then came the shocking hypocrisy. He immediately executed the two generals who had helped him win, piously condemning them for their helpful treachery.
So he solved one problem while creating a deep, lasting loyalty deficit among his own forces.
He ensured no one could ever truly trust him again.
But maybe the most telling aspect of this whole section is the Roman and Christian obsession with why the tsunami happened. Given the scale of the trauma, the population needed an explanation that fit their moral framework.
Absolutely. The sources reveal this profound psychological need for cosmic justice.
Right. There was no comfortable place in the Roman or Christian mind for an event that was not a direct response to human moral action.
No place for random evil or natural indifference. I mean, if the sea can just rise up and kill thousands for no reason, then everything they understood about order was just wrong.
So you get these wildly conflicting interpretations, all trying to restore some kind of moral order to the indiscriminate death.
Right. The traditional Roman chroniclers, like Ammianus, they actually moved the way forward in time in their narrative. They insisted the natural upheaval was caused by Procopius's rebellion.
Treason shook the cosmos itself.
Exactly. And the Christian historians, facing the same need for an explanation, they offered a different but equally human-centric reason. God was punishing the empire,
For the misdeeds of Julian the Apostate.
who had died a few years earlier. He was the emperor who had famously tried to halt the advance of Christianity and restore the old pagan rites.
So for the Christians, blaming him for the cosmic destruction was a direct continuation of their theological battle. The wave wasn't random, it was divine retribution.
And even Julian's old pagan friend Libanius offered this deeply emotional interpretation. He suggested Earth was mourning Julian's death, that the quake and wave were the honor paid him by Earth, or if you would have it so, by Poseidon.
The takeaway here is profound. Everything had to be a moral event. The trauma of the natural disaster just amplified the political instability.
It made the population ripe for internal conflict because they were already looking for a human, moral cause behind all the destruction.
Following the natural disaster and the usurpation, the political catastrophes just came thick and fast. The outside world, having seen Rome's internal fighting and its distraction, sensed a profound weakness.
The barbarians began coordinating attacks across the vast frontier. They moved from disorganized raids to concerted strategic strikes.
And this phase begins with Valens' completely unnecessary war of revenge against the Goths.
Right. He was punishing the Gothic soldiers who had supported Procopius. And this is where his intolerance is just doubly self-defeating.
Because up until this point, the relationship between Romans and Goths was one of, calculated coexistence.
It was. Goths provided soldiers for the Roman army manpower they desperately needed and were allowed to settle in Roman territory.
And they were also Arian Christians, just like Valens.
Exactly. Their Bishop Evolus, who had invented an alphabet to translate the Bible into Gothic, he preached that Nicene Christianity was an odious and execrable invention of the devil.
So Valens was fighting people who were politically integrated with Rome and theologically aligned with him.
It made absolutely no strategic sense. The war dragged on for 3 full years, from 367 to 369, without any decisive victory.
And it tied up crucial Roman resources that were desperately needed elsewhere.
Desperately. Because while Valens was busy on the Danube, the Western Front completely destabilized.
The Alemanni surged across the Rhine, forcing Valentinian into a pitched battle in Gaul.
He won the tactical fight, but the Roman losses were so severe that he couldn't actually push the invaders back out of the territory. It was a totally incomplete victory.
But the most coordinated and, frankly, frightening collapse happened far to the northwest, in Britannia.
The Barbarian Conspiracy. The Barbarian Conspiracy. Ammianus noted that this was a strategic collapse that hit Britannia from all 4 sides at the same time.
Let's break down that encirclement because it reveals the structural decay of the military command.
Okay, so first, the Picts, who lived north of Hadrian's Wall, that famous dividing line, they crossed over.
And the sources note they had been fraternizing with Roman garrisons for years, which suggests that corruption and complacency had already made the wall porous.
Right. The structural problem was command fragmentation. The Roman defenses were just overwhelmed because the specialized roles had lost their men. You had the Dux Britanniarum, the commander of forces in Britain, and the Comes Littoris Saxonica.
The protector of the Saxon shore focused specifically on coastal defense.
Exactly. They had specialized roles for specialized threats. But the sources are clear on the root cause of the collapse.
The Roman forces in Britannia had been slowly but surely depleted.
By transfers to the mainland army to fight in Gaul and along the Danube, Rome was cannibalizing its specialized, dedicated frontier defenses for short-term fixes in Europe.
So when the coordinated attacks came from the Picts, the pirates from Ireland, and the Saxons from the sea, the Dux and the Comes were left with.
Not enough troops to do their jobs. It's a textbook case of strategic short-sightedness. You save your center by bleeding your extremities dry.
Valentinian had to respond forcefully. In 368, he sent the vastly experienced general Theodosius the Elder.
And he took his son, Flavius Theodosius, as his vice commander. They set up a base in Londinium, a city of 25,000 complex Roman infrastructure, and waged this year-long brutal campaign.
And we get that famous, brutal quote from the poet Claudian, admiring the victory. He said that Theodosius warmed the north with Pictish blood, and icy Ireland wept for the heaps of dead.
The victory was comprehensive, yes, but the cost was profound.
The sources stressed that while Roman control was technically restored, the damage was immense.
Ravaged cities, burned settlements, wiped out garrisons, destroyed trade networks, and crucially, the remaining garrisons along the northern border were isolated, shut into crude, temporary fortresses.
The victory was a temporary stabilization, not a permanent reversal. It solidified the understanding that the periphery of the empire was now a dangerous liability.
It required constant, expensive attention.
Back in the empire proper, the brothers finally made peace with their enemies. Valens with the Goths in 369, Valentinian with the Alemanni in 374.
But peace didn't last, because of another self-inflicted wound. The Quadi War. A failure of diplomacy so egregious it cost Valentinian his life.
This is the definitive example of local Roman arrogance and command failure leading directly to imperial catastrophe.
Valentinian ordered new forts built north of the Danube in land belonging to the Germanic tribe, the Quadi. Ammianus considered them a nation not greatly to be feared. They weren't an existential threat.
But they were deeply insulted by the encroachment. The Quadi sent polite embassies asking the local Roman commander to stop building on their land.
And the sources say they were just ignored. They sent embassies again, making formal complaints, and were again ignored. It shows this institutionalized arrogance on the Roman side.
And the commander's subsequent reaction was just unbelievably reckless. It violated every rule of diplomacy and sacred hospitality.
He couldn't think of a diplomatic solution, so he invited the Quadi king to a banquet and murdered him.
It wasn't just a crime. It was an act of profound betrayal and insult.
The outrage was immediate. The enraged Quadi stormed across the Danube, joining with their neighbors. The sources detail the horrifying consequence. They fell upon Roman frontier farmers who were busy with the harvest, killing most and taking the survivors prisoner.
One commander's single act of short-sighted violence led to mass civilian slaughter.
Valentinian, when he heard, was initially furious with the commander who started it. He recalled Theodosius the Elder and his son from Britain to handle it.
But when Valentinian arrived and saw the devastation himself, his anger became uncontrollable.
He completely ignored the initial murder of the Quadi king, the root cause of the whole thing, and launched a massive, punitive invasion, leading the attack personally.
Ammianus noted, disapprovingly, that he burned villages and put to death without distinction of age all Quadi civilians he could find.
This is the soldier emperor completely losing his strategic mind and letting pure, unadulterated vengeance rule his decisions.
The sources suggest he had lost touch with reality entirely by this point.
The evidence points to a massive instability in his temperament. He cut off a groom's hand after a minor incident with a horse.
He had a junior secretary tortured to death for an ill-timed joke.
And most tragically for the empire, he ordered the execution of Theodosius the Elder, the general who had just saved Britain after a minor battle loss. And he exiled Theodosius' son, Flavius, to Hispania.
His paranoia and rage were just eating the state from within.
And the ultimate chilling irony is that Valentinian's life ended not on the battlefield, but in a self-inflicted fit of rage.
The Quadi, still trying to stop the slaughter, sent ambassadors to negotiate one last time. They were trying to explain they weren't the original aggressors.
And Ammianus records the final scene with incredible detail. Valentinian grew so pathologically enraged during the exchange that he suffered a stroke. He was struck as if by a bolt from the sky, speechless and suffocating, his face tinged with a fiery flush.
Wait, so the emperor who saved the West dies not fighting barbarians, but from literally soaking on his own anger at an ambassador trying to make peace.
It perfectly encapsulates the internal failure that defines this era. He died instantly, without naming an heir.
A soldier who refused to heed warnings from his officers about his brother.
Died because he refused to heed the pleas of ambassadors about the necessity of diplomacy. His rage became a physical, deadly enemy, far more effective than the Quadi themselves.
With Valentinian gone, the Western Empire was temporarily leaderless. The generals had to quickly elevate his 16-year-old son, Gratian, and his 4-year-old half-brother, Valentinian II.
Which created an immediate, desperate need for actual competence.
And credit where it's due, Gratian showed immense good judgment for a teenager.
His first major decision was recalling Flavius Theodosius, the son of the general his father had unjustly executed, from exile in Hispania.
He put him in charge of the northern frontier defense.
Recognizing that competence, not family history, was the only thing that mattered now.
So the son of the general who saved Britain gets a second chance, just as the empire is facing its biggest existential threat yet.
And he proved to be a brilliant strategist. He rapidly became the highest-ranking general in the central province by 376.
And his skill was immediately needed because rumors arrived of a new, terrifying existential threat.
The Huns.
This is where we see the Roman inability to comprehend the outside world manifest as full-blown mythology and panic.
The Huns were described as merciless, nomadic enemies from the east, seemingly unstoppable. Fearless fighters who, according to the sources, had no religion, no proper language, no fixed concept of right and wrong. They had driven the Alans, and even the powerful Gothic king before them, in this wave of terror.
The Romans had no concept of steppe nomad warfare, and so they had no idea where they came from, only that it was awful.
And that deep fear led to some genuinely disturbing and fascinating mythological explanations for who they were.
The historian Procopius, for instance, insisted that the Huns were descended from witches who had sexual congress with demons,
producing a stunted, foul, and puny tribe, scarcely human. This story was a clear effort by Christian chroniclers to fit the Huns into a known theological framework.
So the Christian interpretation was that the Huns were not just another band of barbarians.
They were literally demons out to destroy the Christian kingdom of God on earth. This magnified the political threat into a theological apocalypse, and it just increased the panic exponentially.
And this distant, terrifying threat, the Huns, created the immediate, overwhelming problem closer to home.
A flood of Gothic refugees crowding the Danube, desperately seeking the security of Roman territory. They were terrified of the Huns and saw Rome as their only sanctuary.
This brings us to Valens' second and ultimately final, fatal decision in 376 AD. He allowed these massive masses of Goths to settle in Thracia.
Valens saw this as a win-win. The Goths would get security, farm uncultivated land, and provide a huge influx of desperately needed soldiers for the Roman army.
On paper, it was meant to be a solution to both the refugee crisis and the manpower shortage. It followed established Roman practice.
But the sources are absolutely clear. The execution of this plan was not just a failure. It was a criminal, administrative disaster that guaranteed war.
It was utter institutional collapse born of greed.
Completely. The Roman officials who were supposed to manage the massive influx of people administrators like the military commander Lupicinus and the civil governor Maximus, they saw the Goths not as future soldiers or settlers,
but as an opportunity for instant, massive profit.
They were trying to squeeze a desperate population for personal gain.
How exactly did this corruption manifest?
It was systematic cruelty. The Roman officials were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of Goths, hundreds of thousands, and they mishandled taxes, misappropriated funds, and, most critically, they deliberately withheld the food supplies.
So the Goths, who had surrendered their weapons at the border, began to starve en masse.
They created a controlled humanitarian crisis, and they used the starvation as leverage.
The sources detail how the corrupt officials would sell the starving Goths portions of rotten or spoiled meat at astronomical inflated prices.
And when the Goths ran out of gold and silver, the officials began demanding human collateral.
This is where we get that most damning detail, that Goths were forced to trade their own children into slavery.
For a meager amount of dog meat, which the Romans would then sell them at exorbitant rates.
That is just profound institutional betrayal. A group that was meant to be allies and future soldiers was starved, abused, and exploited by Roman administrators.
The Goths were fighting for survival, not conquest. Within 2 years, this policy of deliberate mismanagement and corruption resulted in a full-scale war.
The army of angry Goths, realizing they were being systematically starved to death by their supposed allies, stormed through Thracia.
The sources describe a most foul confusion of robbery, murder, bloodshed, and fires. They were killing and burning villages, heading straight for the walls of Constantinople.
Valens finally recognized the military threat and set out from Antioch. Brescian, in the west, was en route with reinforcements led by Flavius Theodosius.
But Valens, showing his characteristic impatience and poor judgment, plunged into battle before Gratian could arrive. He was eager to claim the victory for himself.
This was the Battle of Hadrianople, August 9, 378 AD, the final devastating blow of this 14-year period.
It was an unmitigated catastrophe. The sources note Valens was killed, and two-thirds of his entire army fell with him.
And the Roman soldiers were already at a tactical disadvantage. They were suffering from thirst and starvation after their forced march in the burning August sun.
The end of Valens is just tragically ignominious. It reflects the breakdown of the very system he tried to purify.
He wasn't wearing the imperial purple, so he was indistinguishable from any other general.
His body was so badly disfigured and lost in the chaos that it was never identified. He was denied even a proper imperial burial.
Ammianus gave that morbid description of the aftermath.
He did. The ground was ankle-deep in blood. And all night long, the wails and death rattles of the wounded left on the battlefield could be heard clearly from the city of Hadrianople.
It was the most severe Roman military defeat in centuries, a clear indicator that the old military machine was broken.
And while the Goths failed at the sieges of Hadrianople and Constantinople, they were still an army of raiders, not professional besiegers. The message delivered by those two-thirds of the dead Roman soldiers was chillingly clear.
The lasting legacy of these 14 years is the absolute recognition of vulnerability.
The Roman Empire was far from all conquering. An earthquake and flood could wreck it. A distant band of barbarians like the Huns could disrupt it.
And critically, a ragged band of exiles, the Goths, could bring down the emperor and his army because of deliberate, systematic, internal Roman incompetence and greed.
The mechanisms of collapse were entirely homegrown.
We've taken this deep dive through what Ammianus Marcellinus called the ferocity of changeable circumstances, and that phrase just perfectly captures the spirit of the era.
It really does. We saw a period where political failures, Valens' crippling ideological intolerance, and Valentinian's self-destructive rage were compounded by truly uncontrollable external forces.
Like the 365 AD tsunami and the migration pressure driven by the Huns.
But what the sources reveal is that the empire's greatest vulnerability wasn't the sheer number of barbarians at the gates.
No, it was the abject failure of administration and leadership to manage simultaneous, layered crises.
The Quades were easily provoked by institutional arrogance. And the Goths, who were meant to be allies and farmers, were turned into a vengeful army because corrupt Roman officials mishandled resources and forced citizens to trade their children for survival.
The empire turned its most promising potential allies into its most deadly, effective enemies through internal mismanagement.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for us today? We began with Ammianus noting that Rome's religion and frontiers shifted quickly. We saw that the fatal threats to the Roman world came not from outside, but from the inability of its leaders to manage resource distribution, immigration, and maintain administrative integrity.
They failed to solve a political problem with competence, and that failure resulted in catastrophic military defeat.
That raises an important question for you to consider.
Right. What current challenges are we facing today, whether they relate to migration, resource scarcity, or environmental shifts, that look like insurmountable external threats, but are in fact crises born primarily of internal, political, administrative, or managerial failure? Are we making allies into enemies through incompetence? That's something worth mulling over until our next deep dive.